Rain clung to the cobblestones like a shroud the night I first glimpsed the Grayson estate looming at the end of the crooked road. Its silhouette cut against the sky like a rotting monument to everything the village refused to speak of. Stories had drifted through the region for more than a century, stories of doors that locked themselves, voices calling from empty rooms, and lights flickering in windows long after the last Grayson had been buried. No one ventured near the place anymore, even the wind seemed to avoid brushing against its blackened walls. Yet something about that house drew the curious, the desperate, and the foolish. They said the Graysons were cursed, marked by something ancient that lived beneath the floorboards and fed on secrets the family tried to bury. They also said the house never let anyone leave once it decided to keep them. The first vanishing in 1894 began as nothing more than a hushed rumor, one of those tales whispered around tavern tables and exchanged by travelers eager to trade fear for attention. But beneath the exaggerations and embellishments, there existed a core of cold truth that no one in the village ever dared say aloud. The Grayson mansion at the time was in its full, sinister bloom, tall, proud, richly adorned, and utterly hollow on the inside. Its grand, echoing halls were built not for warmth, but for intimidation, the kind that seeped into the bones of visitors who stepped over the threshold. When Edward Mallory, a young historian fascinated by old families and their sprawling estates, arrived in the village, he came with cheerful arrogance, certain that the tales were nothing more than folklore designed to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. He carried notebooks, sketches, and maps, tools for unraveling the past, but nothing that could protect him from what the Grayson mansion chose to awaken that night. Edward had been personally invited by Alastair Grayson, the patriarch known for his piercing gaze and unsettling ability to appear in rooms without making a sound. To outsiders, Alastair had always seemed more like a shadow wearing a man's face, and Edward, in his naive curiosity, found this peculiarity fascinating rather than frightening. When he arrived at the mansion, soaked from the evening rain, he was greeted not by servants or family members, but by Alastair himself, who led him through dim corridors lit by oil lamps that flickered as though disturbed by an invisible breath. The historian noted the strange carvings etched into the wooden panels, symbols that did not belong to any language he recognized, twisting shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Alastair dismissed them with a tight smile, claiming they were heritage marks, the kind only the family knew how to interpret. The evening seemed ordinary at first. A late supper was served in a dining hall far too large for the number of guests present, the silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock whose chimes rang a second too late each hour. Edward conversed politely, though it became clear that the Graysons were not a family willing to share their history easily. Their answers were clipped, their smiles strained, and their glances toward the far end of the table carried an unspoken warning he was too inexperienced to decipher. When the time came for Edward to retire to his room, Alastair guided him to the third floor, to a chamber that smelled faintly of damp wood and old paper. The door was heavy, reinforced with iron hinges, and Edward noticed deep scratches along its edge, marks that appeared fresh, as though something with claws had tried to escape or enter. He laughed nervously about it, assuming it to be caused by age or pests. Alastair did not laugh back. He simply placed a hand on Edward's shoulder, squeezed once, and said in a voice devoid of warmth, "Sleep well. The house knows you're here now." Before Edward could question what he meant, the patriarch had slipped away down the hallway, his footsteps swallowed by the silence. Edward's night began uneventfully. He wrote in his journal, recorded his observations, and sketched the strange symbols he had seen carved into the walls. But as the hour grew late, a cold draft swept through the room despite the windows being shut. The lamp on his writing desk flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that crawled across the floor like living things. Edward tried to ignore it, attributing the sensation to fatigue. But when he finally lay down and closed his eyes, he heard it, a soft scratching from the inside of the wardrobe, rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of nails dragging across wood. When he approached the wardrobe, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint whisper that rose from behind the door as though someone were standing inside it. He froze, breath caught in his throat. The whispering grew louder, forming fragmented words he could barely understand, but one repeated again and again, his name. Edward staggered back, convinced he was imagining it, and reached for the door handle to reassure himself that nothing was there. But before his fingers touched the metal, the door shuddered violently, a sharp thud echoing through the room, followed by another, and another, as though something trapped inside was trying to break free. Edward bolted to the door, trying desperately to leave, but the handle refused to turn. The lock rattled beneath his grip, unmoving, sealed from the outside by an unseen force. The scratching intensified, now coming from the door he was trying to open, long, angry strokes gouging the wood from the inside of the room. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as the air grew heavier, thicker, as though the room itself were breathing. He shouted for help, but his voice died against the walls, smothered by something that didn't want it to reach anyone beyond that chamber. By the next morning, Edward Mallory was gone. The door to his room was found locked from the outside, and the deep scratches around its edges were twice as long and far deeper than the night before. Alastair Grayson informed the villagers that Edward had left early, claiming he had received an urgent summons. No one believed him. The historian's belongings remained untouched in the room, his journal open to a half-written sentence. The servants whispered that the house had taken him, that it had chosen him the moment he stepped inside. And from that night on, no visitor ever slept in that room again. The decision to seal the Grayson basement in 1911 did not arise from a single event, but from an accumulation of nights soaked in dread, nights when even the bravest servants refused to step foot into the lower corridors after sunset. The Grayson home had always carried an atmosphere of quiet unease, but in the years following Edward Mallory's disappearance, something beneath the floorboards began to stir with a persistence that no family member could ignore. It began subtly at first, echoes of footsteps descending the basement stairs when no one was near them, the faint clinking of chains despite no record of such objects ever being stored below, and whispers that seemed to drift upward through the wooden planks like steam. The voices did not speak in recognizable sentences, but their tone was unmistakably human, and worse, familiar enough that certain family members claimed to hear the names of their dead. Alastair Grayson, who had always carried himself with calculated calm, was the first to acknowledge that something had changed. His demeanor grew more rigid, his expression more hollow, as though every sound from the basement chipped away at his composure. It became common for him to pause mid-conversation, eyes flicking downward as though listening to something the others could not hear. His wife, Evelyn, insisted that the disturbances were just the old house settling, but even she could not maintain this facade when the nightly groans began, the long, drawn-out moans that rose through the walls and seemed to creep into the bedrooms, shaking the mirrors and rattling the glass of the oil lamps. On the worst nights, the sounds were so loud that they woke the entire household. Servants huddled in groups, clutching their rosaries and muttering prayers, while Alastair stood alone in the hallway, staring toward the stairwell with a look of utter resignation. The disturbances escalated dramatically one stormy evening when lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the mansion's interior through its stained windows. A young maid named Clara Mayfield was the first to hear the voice that night, a voice unmistakably belonging to her sister, who had died years earlier. The voice called to her gently at first, then with increasing urgency, telling her to come downstairs, telling her she had been waiting so long. Clara's scream shook the household awake, and when they found her, she was standing at the top of the basement stairs in her nightdress, her face pale and her hands shaking violently. She insisted she had seen her sister's silhouette at the foot of the steps, watching her. But when the others held their lanterns over the stairwell, the light revealed only the yawning darkness of the basement, deeper than it had ever seemed before. After that night, Clara refused to stay in the mansion. She fled the next morning and never returned. Her departure signaled the first of several resignations, each accompanied by similar stories, whispers drifting up from the cellar, footsteps pacing beneath the floor, the sensation of being watched from below. The remaining staff begged Alastair to do something, to allow a priest to bless the lower chambers, but he refused all such offers, claiming that what lies below belongs to the Grayson bloodline, and no outsider must interfere. His cryptic statement only fueled the servants' terror, and speculation twisted through the estate like a creeping vine. Some believed the basement held the remains of something the family had tried to forget. Others claimed the original Graysons had practiced rituals there, rituals that might have awakened whatever now stirred in the depths. The final turning point came during an unusually cold autumn night when the noises grew louder than ever before. The house trembled with each pounding thud rising from the basement, and a deep scraping sound tore through the floorboards as though something with tremendous strength was trying to claw its way upward. The chandelier swung violently, as if shaken by unseen hands, and the candles along the walls blew out one by one. Alastair, normally composed to the point of indifference, was seen running through the hallways with a lantern gripped tightly in his hand, calling for his children to stay in their rooms. Evelyn wept openly, her voice cracking with fear as she begged her husband to leave the house with her and never return. But Alastair refused, shouting over the deafening noise that if they left now, the thing in the basement would follow. When the pounding finally stopped, an unnatural silence fell over the mansion, thick, smothering, suffocating. Alastair gathered the servants and demanded complete secrecy regarding what had happened. None of them dared to object. The next morning, he summoned a team of workers from a nearby iron foundry, paying them double their usual wage to seal the basement entrance. The workers hesitated at first, for the very request felt wrong, but Alastair's desperation overrode their reluctance. Over the course of a long, tense day, they bolted thick iron plates over the basement door, welded the seams, and reinforced the surrounding walls. The air grew colder with each strike of the hammer, as if the house itself recoiled from what was being done, but Alastair insisted the work continue until not even a sliver of darkness remained exposed. When the job was complete, he dismissed the workers and stood before the sealed door in silence. The servants watched from a distance, unwilling to approach. Alastair pressed his hand against the iron, his face drained of color, as though listening one last time for any sound from within. For a moment, he believed he heard a faint whisper calling his name, but he forced himself to turn away and ordered that no one ever mention the basement again. From that day forward, the Grayson mansion grew quieter, but the silence felt wrong, like a temporary pause rather than a true ending. Rumors spread through the village that something still lived beneath the house, locked away, waiting, patient as ever, and that the Grayson family had only sealed a wound that would one day break open again. The Night of the Red Lanterns in 1936 became one of the most infamous chapters in the long, haunted chronicle of the Grayson family, a night so unsettling that even decades later, villagers refused to speak of it without lowering their voices and glancing over their shoulders. By that time, the mansion had already earned its reputation as a place touched by something unnatural. The basement had been sealed for 25 years, but the iron plates did nothing to quiet the unease that clung to every inch of the estate. The last remaining members of the Grayson family had gradually abandoned the house, leaving it to rot in the silence of the surrounding woods. For a while, the village believed the mansion might finally go dormant, its dark hunger satisfied or at least stilled. But such relief was short-lived, for the house had never lost its awareness, and it had certainly never forgotten the hands that had dared to imprison whatever lived beneath it. On the evening of October 14th, thick fog rolled down from the hills and blanketed the countryside in a pale shroud. There were no storms, no unusual winds, just a suffocating stillness that made the villagers uneasy as the sun dipped below the horizon. They had learned long ago that unnatural calm was often a precursor to the mansion's darker moods. At exactly 8:03 p.m., the first disturbance occurred. Every lamp and lantern within a mile of the old estate dimmed to a faint pulse, as if exhaling a final breath. Those who lived closest to the woods claimed they heard a low hum vibrating through the ground, too gentle to be alarming but too steady to dismiss. Dogs began to whine, livestock pressed themselves against barn walls, and birds fell eerily silent in the trees. What followed was witnessed by more than a dozen people, though each described it differently, as though their minds were unable to agree on what was real. The mansion, which had been unoccupied for months, lit up from within. But the light that spilled through its windows was not the golden hue of candles or the warm flicker of oil lamps. Instead, a deep, unsettling red glow filled every room, bathing the structure in a color reminiscent of smoldering embers. The effect was grotesque, turning the house into something that looked more alive than inhabited, as if each window were a watchful eye blinking awake after a long sleep. At first, the villagers believed someone must have broken in, perhaps vandals or foolish thrill-seekers. But the longer they watched, the more apparent it became that no human hand was responsible. The red glow pulsed, dimming and brightening in a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. Some claimed they saw movement behind the windows, shadows crossing from one side to another, silhouettes gliding past the glass in long, fluid motions. The house had been empty for months, yet it looked busier than it had ever been, as though a silent congregation had gathered inside. One witness, the elderly woodcutter Benjamin Stroud, insisted he saw a figure standing in the second-floor window. He described it as tall and thin, with limbs too long for its body, and said it tilted its head as though listening to something only it could hear. Benjamin fled before anyone else could confirm his sighting, but the terror etched into his face afterward was enough to lend weight to his account. Others claimed the movements they saw were too numerous to belong to a single person. Dozens of shapes seemed to drift room to room, some moving with the steady pace of someone walking, others gliding as if they had no need for legs at all. The red glow intensified as the night deepened, and a low vibration began to emanate from the mansion, traveling through the earth and settling uneasily in the villagers' bones. It was not loud, but impossibly deep, like the rumble of something vast turning over in its sleep beneath the floorboards. A few brave souls, or perhaps the foolishly curious, ventured closer to the edge of the woods, drawn by the unnatural light. They never stepped beyond the tree line, unwilling to test whatever boundary separated safety from doom, but they swore they heard voices drifting from the mansion. The voices were faint yet unmistakably human, murmuring in tones that carried neither warmth nor malice. Instead, they sounded weary, trapped, as if endlessly repeating the same pleas to no one who could help them. The strangest part of the event occurred just after midnight, when all the lights within the mansion suddenly synchronized, brightening until the red glow was almost blinding. For one brief moment, every window burst with a brilliant crimson flash that illuminated the fog-choked woods and cast long, distorted shadows across the landscape. Some villagers shielded their eyes. Others dropped to their knees, convinced that whatever had been contained beneath the basement had finally broken free. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the light vanished. The mansion went dark. The vibration stopped. The forest returned to silence, as if the entire thing had been an illusion. At dawn, a small group gathered the courage to approach the estate. They found the house exactly as it had been, abandoned, decaying, its windows dark and lifeless. But there was one difference: every lantern, candle, and lamp inside the mansion had been placed neatly on the floors and window sills, each one filled with fresh oil, each wick trimmed with impossible precision. They were arranged in perfect order, as if prepared for a ritual or vigil. None of the villagers had entered the house in months, and no one claimed responsibility for the arrangement. More unsettling still was the faint smell of iron in the air, as though something metallic had seeped up from the sealed basement. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in the mansion's haunting. People no longer spoke of apparitions or disembodied voices alone. They realized the house itself was capable of awakening, of illuminating its own dark interior with a glow that had no earthly explanation. And though nothing like the red lanterns ever happened again, the memory of that night lingered like an open wound, reminding everyone that the mansion was not dormant, merely waiting. The return of the last Grayson in 1968 was an event that rippled through the village like a long-forgotten ghost suddenly knocking at the door. After decades of abandonment, decay, and inexplicable happenings, no one expected to see another living member of that cursed lineage cross the threshold of the mansion. His name was Rowan Grayson, a man in his late 30s with the kind of tired, haunted eyes that spoke of a life already worn thin. He had inherited the estate after the death of a distant uncle, though most villagers believed the uncle had been dead long before anyone found his body. Rowan arrived quietly, without ceremony, carrying only a suitcase and a box of old family documents wrapped in twine. He claimed he wished to restore the mansion, to reclaim the family's history, and to silence the rumors that had stained the Grayson name for generations. But those who watched him walk up the overgrown path swore he looked less like a man coming home and more like a man being summoned. From the moment Rowan stepped inside the mansion, the atmosphere shifted. The house had always possessed a strange awareness, an ability to respond to those who dared to enter its halls, but with Rowan, it seemed almost eager, as though recognizing the blood that pulsed through his veins. Dust swirled in the stale air despite the absence of any breeze, floorboards groaned under steps he had not yet taken, and doors creaked open on their own as if guiding him deeper. Rowan, however, appeared unfazed. He wandered through each room with an expression of resignation, touching the walls lightly as though reacquainting himself with something both loved and feared. The villagers expected him to stay only a few nights before fleeing like everyone else, yet Rowan remained. He set up a makeshift study in the old library, a room lined with shelves so warped by time they seemed to bow under the weight of untold secrets. Here, he pored over the documents he had brought with him, family letters, faded maps of the estate, and journals written by ancestors who had slowly slipped into madness over the centuries. Some entries described strange shapes glimpsed in mirrors, others recounted dreams so vivid they left physical marks on the writer's skin, and more than one warned that the true heart of the Grayson curse lay sealed beneath the mansion. Rowan read each word with increasing obsession, his handwriting growing erratic in the margins as he made notes, crossed out ideas, and scribbled questions that grew more frantic with each passing day. It was not long before he began hearing the noises the villagers had long feared. At first, they came at night, soft tapping along the walls, the distant echo of footsteps pacing the ground floor, and whispers that trickled beneath his door like a chilling draft. Rowan attempted to rationalize the disturbances, telling himself the house was simply settling, that his mind was exhausted. But then the voices began calling his name. He heard them in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, a chorus of hushed tones rising from the floorboards, speaking with the cadence of voices long dead. One night, Rowan awoke to the sound of weeping, faint and fragile, coming from the sealed basement. He pressed his ear to the floor and felt the vibrations of something shifting beneath the iron plates, as though responding to his presence. Despite the growing terror, Rowan refused to leave. Instead, he documented everything, filling page after page with descriptions of each sound, each shadow that moved where it shouldn't, each moment when the temperature dropped so suddenly his breath crystallized in the air. The villagers, worried for his sanity, attempted to intervene. They visited the mansion, calling out to him from the gate, begging him to return to the village before the house consumed him like it had consumed everyone else. Rowan ignored them. Some nights, they could see him through an upstairs window, pacing with a lantern in hand, muttering urgently to himself while the shadows in the room seemed to flicker in ways unrelated to the lantern's flame. Weeks passed, and Rowan's journal entries became increasingly disordered. He wrote of hands reaching out from corners he could not see, of reflections in the mirrors that did not move with him, of the house breathing, slow, deep breaths that shook the walls. He began to believe that the mansion was alive, not metaphorically, but truly alive, and that it had been waiting for him specifically. One entry described a dream in which every ancestor of the Grayson line stood behind him in a long, silent procession, their faces hollow and pleading, urging him to finish what they could not. Another entry detailed his certainty that whatever was sealed in the basement was not a monster, but a part of the family itself, something bound generations ago and left to fester. As Rowan's mind unraveled, the villagers became convinced he would suffer the same fate as those before him. One night, lights flickered through the mansion's dark windows, dim, erratic glows moving from room to room, resembling lanterns carried by unseen hands. The villagers watched from a distance, too afraid to approach. They saw Rowan's silhouette darting through the halls, heard distant shouting, and felt the tremors that rippled through the ground beneath their feet. It was as though the house was engaged in some violent struggle with him. After that night, Rowan was rarely seen outside. He ate little, slept sporadically, and left the lanterns burning long after sunrise. His final journal entries were almost illegible, written in frantic, looping strokes that spoke of a man slipping beyond the edge of sanity. He wrote that the whispers had grown louder, that the house wanted him to descend into the sealed basement, that it had shown him things he could no longer ignore. His last coherent sentence hinted at his intention to uncover the truth and end the curse once and for all. Then, one morning, the mansion fell silent. The villagers, sensing something was terribly wrong, gathered near the gate. Rowan did not appear, not at the window, not in the doorway, not even as a shadow drifting across the halls. It was as if he had vanished into the very walls he had spent so many nights studying. Inside his study, the lamp still burned, his journal lay open, and every door in the mansion stood ajar, as if left in haste. But Rowan Grayson himself was nowhere to be found. The investigation launched in 1974 was not a formal one in the official sense, no authorities were involved, no police stepped onto the rotting porch, and no government agency dared to touch what locals whispered was a curse disguised as a house. Instead, it was a gathering of individuals bound by desperation, curiosity, and an unspoken understanding that something had gone profoundly wrong within the Grayson estate. Rowan's disappearance had left the village uneasy in a way no previous tragedy had. The house had taken visitors before, had devoured the unwary, had whispered horrors through the floorboards, but Rowan had been the last of the bloodline, and his arrival had stirred something deeper, something the villagers felt even from a distance. And when the mansion fell silent one morning after weeks of strange lights and trembling halls, they knew the house was not resting. It was digesting. It was Margaret Hale, a retired schoolteacher with a stubborn streak that age had failed to soften, who insisted they could no longer ignore the mansion. She claimed Rowan had visited her the year before, seeking information on the village's oral histories, and she felt responsible for not warning him more forcefully. Alongside her were Thomas Boyd, a local carpenter familiar with the structure of old homes, Father Elias, a priest who had spent 20 years resisting the villagers' attempts to pull him into their superstitions, and 2 others whose motivations ranged from terrified concern to morbid fascination. Together, 5 villagers approached the mansion on an overcast morning when the sky hung low and heavy, casting a dull grey glow over the property. As they made their way through the overgrown path, the air grew colder. Not the kind of chill that drifted down from the mountains or came before rain, but a stagnant, dead cold that seemed to radiate from the house itself. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark, its roof sagging, its once imposing frame now resembling a dying beast too exhausted to hide its decay. Yet there was an undeniable tension in the air, as though the house sensed their approach and was quietly shifting, preparing, watching. The front door, swollen by years of moisture, hung slightly ajar. Thomas pushed it carefully, and the hinges emitted a long, groaning wail that reverberated through the empty halls like a warning. Dust swirled up in a thick cloud, catching the dim light as though forming ghostly shapes. Margaret clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes wide but determined. Father Elias muttered a prayer under his breath, though he still refused to admit that anything supernatural was at play. The interior smelled of damp wood, stale air, and something faintly metallic. Every step they took stirred echoes that seemed too loud for an empty house. Dust-covered furniture lined the rooms in awkward, unnatural angles, as if shoved aside in haste. Cobwebs clung to walls, but what unsettled the group most were the lanterns. Dozens of them. They lined the hallways, rested on window sills, sat in clusters on the floor, each one filled with fresh oil, each wick trimmed with meticulous precision. It was as if Rowan had been preparing for some ritual, or as if the house had arranged them itself, the way a predator might set a trap. They found Rowan's study next. The lamp still burned, though weakly, its flames struggling as if starved for oxygen. His journal lay open on the desk, the ink smudged by what appeared to be hurried, trembling hands. Pages were torn out, scattered across the floor. One page bore the repeated phrase, "It wants to be whole." Another contained sketches of a door surrounded by strange markings identical to those carved into the mansion's walls. The group stared at the drawings, the implications hanging unspoken between them. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere below. Father Elias insisted it must be the pipes or an animal trapped under the floorboards, but the others exchanged fearful glances. The basement had been sealed for decades, yet the tapping continued, growing louder, more persistent, as though responding to their presence. Thomas, against better judgment, suggested they check the basement entrance to ensure Rowan hadn't somehow unsealed it. Margaret protested, but her voice trembled with uncertainty. The idea that Rowan had willingly gone down there terrified her more than the notion of something emerging. They approached the corridor leading to the basement, the temperature dropping with each step. The air thickened, becoming heavy and difficult to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though reacting to their presence. When they reached the iron-sealed door, they saw that the metal was no longer intact. The plates had bent outward, warped by immense force, their edges torn like thin paper. Deep gouges marred the floor around the doorway, and the faint smell of iron, too sharp, too warm, hung in the air. The tapping ceased. In the sudden stillness, Margaret felt something brush past her, cold and swift, like a breath exhaled directly against the back of her neck. Thomas suggested they leave at once, but Margaret stepped closer to the doorway, her fear now joined by a strange compulsion, as if something beyond the threshold were calling her. Before she could say a word, the floorboards beneath their feet quivered, and a low humming sound rose from below, distant at first, then swelling into a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate inside their bones. The house began to tremble, not violently, but with a steady, rhythmic cadence that felt disturbingly alive. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, lengthening and twisting in ways no lantern light should allow. The air darkened, thickened, becoming almost visible with swirling shapes that pulsed in and out of focus. Father Elias clutched his crucifix, his earlier skepticism forgotten as he whispered prayers through clenched teeth. Thomas grabbed Margaret's arm and urged her back, but she remained rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the warped metal. A faint voice rose from the darkness. Not Rowan's. Not entirely human. A layered whisper, dozens of tones overlapping, speaking a single word that none of them understood yet all recognized instinctively as a summons. That was when the house exhaled. A cold, powerful wind blasted through the corridor, extinguishing every lantern in an instant and plunging them into suffocating darkness. The group fled, stumbling through the halls, guided only by memory and the faint glow of the open front door. Behind them, the humming grew louder, the shadows thicker, as though something massive was rising from the depths. They didn't stop running until they reached the village. When they looked back, the mansion stood silent once more, the door closed, the windows empty. Rowan was never found. The group spoke little of what they had encountered, but they agreed on one thing: the house was no longer merely cursed. It was becoming something else, something stronger, something that no longer needed the Grayson line to sustain itself.